مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. جديد يبدأ إلى أنه غير تقليدي أبدا. سيكون العام 2024 محوريا في السياسة الأميركية، وحتى بعيدا عن الانتخابات فتطورات الحربين في كل من أوكرانيا والشرق الأوسط ستقرر إن كان النظام العالمي الذي أنشأته الولايات المتحدة في نهاية الحرب العالمية الثانية سيصمد في القرن ال21، وستظهر قرارات المشارعين في مجلسي الشيوخ والنواب إن كانت أمريكا ستنكفئ على نفسها أم أنها ستظل القائد لدول العالم الديمقراطية. أما الانتخابات فهي واحدة من أهم الانتخابات في التاريخ الأمريكي، ومن النادر أن يقود نفس الشخص حزبه في 3 انتخابات متتالية كما يتمنى دونالد ترامب، ومن النادر أيضا أن يتنافس نفس المرشحين المتنافسين في الانتخابات السابقة. لذلك ستشكل الانتخابات حكما على أداء جو بايدن وامتحانا للذاكرة الناخبين فيما يتعلق بسنوات ترامب في بيت الأبيض، وسيؤثر اختيار الناخبين على السياسة في كل ركن من بلادنا وفي كل دولة في العالم. لبحث ما قد يحدث في العام القادم يسرني أن أستضيف الخبراء السياسيين المتمارسين ستيف كليمنز، ميني راكر وكايل كونديك. Welcome back to داخل Washington. We're starting a new year, one of the most consequential in modern American history. Let's take a look at what 2024 has in store with our terrific panelists, Kyle Kondik, Minnie Racker, and Steve Clemens. All right, we all know there's an election, but before we get to an election, there are some other big issues on the agenda that will come even earlier in 2024. Let's start with the prospect that our government is going to shut down. The next deadline is January 19th. Is that when our government is going to shut down, Minnie?
I mean, this happens every year. I think we're used to it by now, and we're just not quite sure yet. It's going to be a fight given the different parties' priorities for funding, and we always kind of come right up to the brink. So I think it's still a little too early to predict until we see exactly how things play out.
So Steve, Kyle, do either of you think that early in 2024 we will have a government shutdown?
Look, I think the chances are very high that we do have some form of short government shutdown, not because of necessarily a weakness. It's just 2024 is an election year, and there are no points that either side gets for playing nice with the other. And we have a lot of issues that continue to percolate with a very thin majority in the House of Representatives and a faction that is strongly opposed to the United States continuing to spend billions of dollars on wars and conflicts beyond its shores, while it's trying to make the case to Americans that it wants to invest in them and worry about America first. So I see a collision. It might be avoided in the last minute. We go through this kabuki repeatedly of getting to the brink, but right now, 2024, I wouldn't bet that it's going to be easy to move past the continuing resolution that expires on the 19th of January.
Kyle, what do you think?
We also have a relatively new Speaker of the House, and I think he has been in a little bit of a honeymoon period, to the extent that any Republican leader has a honeymoon now. He was able to accept a deal that I think the previous Speaker would not have been able to do. And maybe he starts to get pressure from his right flank in his own caucus to fight a little bit harder and not to go along, and that's the sort of thing that could lead to a shutdown. So that's, I think, in play here too, because we know that Republicans are they're not afraid to, at least a handful of Republicans are not afraid to dump their own leader. And maybe we see that happen again in 2024. I don't think you could necessarily rule that out.
So, Minnie, I was going to ask you, we began last year with the remarkable spectacle of a Republican trying to become Speaker of the House, having to go through 15 ballots before he managed to claim that spot. Kevin McCarthy didn't last a year. Is Mike Johnson going to have an easier time of it in 2024?
I mean, I think it's hard to have a harder time than Kevin McCarthy did last year. That said, like Steve talked about, there's going to be a lot of tension over the details of funding, especially the wars abroad, continuing general government funding. I think it's, he has a bank of goodwill still that he can draw on for a little bit, but we're not sure how long that's going to last.
So I'm going to put you guys on the spot, since it'll be a long time since we'll test this proposition. But who here thinks that Mike Johnson will not be Speaker of the House in January 2025?
January 31st, 2025, he may be gone.
He may be gone, but for many reasons.
Well, I mean, he may be gone for many reasons, but I mean, I think that what Kyle just said is really important. He's been in a honeymoon period. He hasn't been tested yet. And you have a very unstable Republican caucus that just lost one of their members, by the way, George Santos. So they're a vote thinner. And that gives anyone who wants to give him a tough day a lot of power. And that motion to vacate, what's called the motion to vacate, where a single member of the House of Representatives can call for a vote. It's essentially a vote of non-confidence. In the Speaker can disrupt him, and the Democrats are going to have to ask themselves whether they might want to support this Republican Mike Johnson, and I don't see that ever happening. So I think he's got a fragile tenure, and this notion that we're going to go from this period of instability and close parity between both parties and think that's somehow going to be stable, I think is an illusion.
So let me broaden this for a minute, because we're focusing on personalities, but I want to ask a bit about the substance. There's a huge test for Congress right now. It combines border security, immigration, and support for the war in Ukraine. How these things have to do with each other is a bit beyond me. Kyle, perhaps you can help explain, what fighting in Ukraine has to do with immigrants coming over our southern border. But that's the way the world works in Washington, and key decisions are about to be made or not made that will have the fate of the Western alliance being determined.
I think there's just like a growing number of Republicans, some Democrats, but mostly Republicans, who just don't really want to spend money in Ukraine for a variety of different reasons. And so in order to go along with that, they basically want something in return. And I think there are plenty of other Republicans, particularly in the Senate, who, believe in the mission in Ukraine, feel like it's been a good use of resources to basically bog down the Russian army in Ukraine and to support someone who was invaded by its neighbor. But there are plenty of other Republicans who don't really support that. And I think you could say that the leader of the Republican Party, the likely presidential nominee, Donald Trump, is also in the, certainly in the skeptical camp in terms of supporting Ukraine. So in order to approve something like that, they're going to want something in return. And Republicans are, been talking about the border a lot. I also think the president, President Biden, may want to be able to say to voters in 2024 that, he did something about problems on the border. I think that during the Trump presidency, this is a classic thing in American politics. During the Trump era, when Trump was so hawkish on immigration, I think the public was like, hey, you're going a little too far. And now in the Biden administration, maybe there's some feeling that, hey, Biden is too soft on the border and you got to do more. And maybe Biden can try to address that if he can come to some sort of deal. But I don't necessarily know what that would look like. And, there have been ongoing negotiations about it. And whether, even Democrats would want to go along with a deal that Biden could potentially cut with Republicans, just because the parties are pretty far apart on immigration policy, among many other things.
Steve, is there a deal that's going to save American support for Ukraine?
Well, it'll be about the border. I mean, you ask about what the connection is. There's no explicit connection other than the fact that every major piece of legislation is going to address the border, because that's what Republicans right now believe is sacrosanct and absolutely vital. So it's not that they're necessarily opposed to funding Ukraine. It's that they have to be overwhelmingly for security on America's southern border. There was an incident where a number of senators were actually yelling at the defense secretary and yelling at members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who came in to give a classified briefing about Ukraine. And they said, why are we hearing about Ukraine? We care about the southern border. So the deal is doable. There's going to be a deal that basically restricts the ability of those coming over the border to call for asylum support. There's going to be more expedited deportations. Things are going to tighten up there. And I think you'll see a demand for more resources broadly, even potentially restarting the wall, though I have a hard time seeing that go through, but that's one of the demands of Republicans. So that is a doable deal. But I think there's something else going on here about Ukraine, which is more disconcerting, which is, I think it's a generational difference in orientation about Russia, Putin, what this means. When you hear President Biden talk about the stakes of Vladimir Putin winning, he's casting it almost as if everybody remembers the Cold War, and they don't. You have a certain generation who remember the stakes involved in America's competition all over the world, with then the Soviet Union. But that is dissipated for a lot of people who just don't understand why Russia invading Ukraine matters that much to them. And that's a bigger problem down the road, because that new generation of people does not have the same Cold War orientation as the 80-year-old guys running for office. And Nikki Haley is not a guy and not 80-year-old, but she also understands those dimensions. But I think there's another big factor in the Ukraine equation that's not discussed enough.
So, Minnie, I saw you nodding your head up and down. You're in that generation that probably doesn't remember Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernyenko, all these names. Do people, younger than Kyle and Steve and myself, do they understand what the stakes are here?
No, I think Steve is right. I think young people are really struggling right now with their problems at home, with not being able to afford things that were, considered basic a generation ago. And they kind of feel like, okay, what's my government doing for me? Much more than they feel like, we have a responsibility elsewhere as a country. And it's true that we might, in the, world affairs certainly affect what's happening in the United States. But I think a lot of young people don't grasp that.
Well, I'll put my cards on the table. I think it's really important, and it would be, such a horrible signal to the world if the United States bailed on support for Ukraine. One can only imagine, the champagne being toasted in Moscow if Congress does not approve massive funding to support the Ukrainians in their fight. That's my Satloff editorial on this question. All right, let's broaden the topic. Let's because we're talking about what's going to happen in 2024. Obviously, big year for elections in America. But I think, given recent news, we have to start our discussion of elections in 2024 with the Supreme Court, which is going to decide whether Donald Trump is even going to be on the ballot. Steve, what's going on here?
Well, the Colorado Supreme Court did something remarkable. They are the first court in the United States to determine in a full-throated way that Donald Trump was an insurrectionist. And according to Article 14, Section 3, those who basically try and overthrow the Constitution and government to which they swore an oath can't run for federal office. And that decision has been stayed until the Supreme Court comes in and weighs in and potentially overturns it. But it's a historic moment because it basically says insurrection matters, and this is a guy who did that. Is it likely to disrupt voting or Donald Trump's chances of winning? No. Right now, the beneficiaries, if this were to hold, which I doubt it will be Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. It's the Republican primary in a state that Republicans did not win in the last election. But it throws in more systemic doubt in, I believe, Donald Trump's, the solvency of his candidacy, particularly with independents. We often talk about Republicans and Democrats, but there are far more independents than either of these two parties. And what guides them in their choice of what they care about often has to do with, the way you look at problem solving, the way you look at civility. And, Donald Trump and being reminded about the fragility of democracy right now is not something that gets you a lot of independent voters. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But right now, Donald Trump at this moment will not appear on the Republican primary ballot in Colorado unless the Supreme Court takes action.
And Kyle, Steve seems pretty confident the Supreme Court is going to overturn this. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that seems reasonable. I mean, one of the things about the Colorado decision is that, that's a court of 7 Democratic appointees, and it was a 4-3 decision. So there's even kind of a split amongst Democratic appointees on something like that. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court is dominated by Republican appointees, including 3 that Donald Trump put on the court himself. And I do think there's if you're critical of what the Colorado Supreme Court did, it's the argument, I guess, is that, Trump, despite having legal problems, he hasn't been like convicted of, backing an insurrection or something. He hasn't really even been charged with that. And so you just, the constitutional amendments that we're talking about here, that date back to the Civil War. I just think it's been kind of a tricky argument to make. And again, it's not even one necessarily that everyone who would naturally think that opposes Trump believes in. So yeah, you would think the U.S. Supreme Court would step in on behalf of Trump. There seems to be a lot of desire for, and I could see where it's coming from, to figure out ways in which Trump basically can't be president again for various legal reasons. And of course, he has all sorts of legal problems. It's going to be a big story in 2024. But the one way to have prevented that from happening was for Trump to actually be convicted in his second impeachment. And then after that would have happened, there could have been a simple majority vote that would have barred him from running for office in the past. There were some Republican senators who went along with that in early 2021, but not enough to convict him and not enough to trigger that vote to prevent him from running for office. And so therefore, I think it's kind of hard to figure out ways in which he can be prevented from running for office. And, the people eventually have to just decide. And that's, the story of 2024.
All right, so we're going to come back after the break, and Minnie, I'm going to ask you about the politics of potential Trump convictions in any one of the many trials that he's facing. I'll just add one note about the Supreme Court. It will be interesting to see all these justices who celebrated states' rights in the Dobbs case dance around depriving the state of Colorado its right under the Constitution. States get to determine their own rules for elections, to see how the Supreme Court dances around state rights to determine the rules for governing an election in the state of Colorado. That will be fascinating to watch. We'll come back with our guests in just a moment. My guests again today include Steve Clemens. Steve is the founding editor-at-large for Semaphore, an international news site. Previously, Steve was at The Hill, The Atlantic, New America Foundation, and the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. Also joining us is Minnie Racker. Minnie is a campaigns staff writer at Time magazine. Previously, she was a staff writer at National Journal, and she reported for the Los Angeles Times. Her work covers the intersection of politics, identity, and culture. And joining us is Kyle Kondik. Kyle is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. He's the author of The Long Red Thread, a history of the growth of Republican power in the U.S. House of Representatives, and of The Bellwether, an analysis of Ohio's presidential voting history. He's also a member of the CBS News Election Decision Desk team. All right, Minnie, Donald Trump faces trials all over America over the next several months. What happens politically if he gets convicted?
I've been doing some reporting on this for the past few weeks, and I think there's a lot of wishful thinking around this. So I was in Iowa a couple of weeks ago talking to Republican conservative voters, not all Trump supporters. Some of them, actively hate Trump and think he's done some things wrong. but almost all of them told me they think Trump's legal issues are the left out to get him or the media out to get him. And I think, aren't going to be swayed by whatever might happen. I think that they feel that, they're a little worried, I think, about some voters being swayed by it. But every voter I talk to says, they would hold their nose and vote for Trump because they just think Biden's so bad. I think it's a little iffier, like Steve said, with independents. I think, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen there, but I think it'll ultimately come down to, the big issues that voters always vote on, things like the economy. And I think, his convictions might not play as big of a role as some DC strategists would like.
Any disagreement on this from Kyle or Steve? Do either of you think that Trump's legal woes will doom his presidential aspirations just to be on the ballot in November, let alone whether or not he wins that election?
Well, I think that what we see in polling among Republicans and Republican tilting independents is that there is an aversion to these court cases and whatnot trying to take him out. There's something in them that is pushed to be more enthusiastic for Trump, even if convicted. It's a non-issue, as many said, but I actually think it increases this view that many who feel demeaned and left behind by the system in America hate the government. When they see government actions or convictions coming down, it only, basically strengthens their belief that Donald Trump is a victim in this story, not a protagonist. I do think that independents are going to have a hard time voting, most of them, for a convicted individual. And we'll have to see how that plays out. But among the Republican Party, which is substantial, we have to understand that if the election were held tomorrow, what we see today from polls is that Donald Trump may very well win that race. So you've got a lot of Americans who just don't care.
I think that Biden does suffer from some perception problems. I also think that a lot of people just believe that he's basically too old to do the job. He's not some sort of awesome orator or something like that.
So let me ask, Minnie, we only have a minute left. When is the last date by which Joe Biden can look in the mirror and say, maybe I am a bit too old for this job and someone else should run in November?
I think the ship has sailed. I think it sailed quite a while ago. Biden has made it pretty clear that, no matter how voters say they feel about him, no matter what he hears from people in his party, he thinks he's the one who can take on Trump, the likely nominee. So I think it's very unlikely we would see that anytime this year.
All right, so we only have a few seconds left. I got to put you guys on the spot, since who knows where this show will be this time next year. Who just got elected president of the United States? Steve Clemens?
Oh, God, Rob. I would say most likely Joe Biden.
Most likely Joe Biden. Kyle Kondik.
I guess I still lean a little bit toward Biden too, even though there are lots of different reasons why that might not happen.
All right, but that's leaning Joe Biden. And Minnie Racker.
I would lean Trump, actually. Again, we don't know, but I'd go the other way.
He might be
all right.
right.
So I get two mild Bidens, one mild Trump. All right, fascinating. I want to thank you all very much for helping explain our inexplicable politics to our viewers in the Middle East. Steve Clemens, Minnie Racker, Kyle Kondik, thank you for joining me on داخل Washington.
Thank you, Rob.
إلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات عن هذه الحلقة وخاصة القرارات المتعلقة بالأجندة السياسية للعام 2024 تواصلوا معي رجاء على تويتر @InsideWashington أو راسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع القادم، شكرا وإلى اللقاء.